how should a new player, someone who's new to DFS, just getting started with things, how should they try to develop their DFS process? Because that's one of the things that everyone talks about is build your process, focus on the process, and this and that. But when you're just getting started out, it's not really even clear what that actually means. So if someone is committed to the game and does want to get better and really build out that process, how would you recommend that they do that?
Yeah, I can take this one. I would say there's a couple of things that just come to mind immediately when you talk about this. I would say one is just reading up, like watching videos. We have a lot of videos with SaberSim on our YouTube channel, reading strategy. Just try to like find all the content you can and just eat up that content, because there's good information out there. There's obviously a lot of smart people who play daily fantasy, and the info is out there and you can always learn more and more. I've been playing daily fantasy for 5 or 6 years, and I still will read articles, or just when someone tweets something out who I follow, I'll read and try to learn something. I think also in that same vein is looking at, especially if you're entering contests that good players are in, maybe even single entry contests or cash games, look at those players' lineups. Look at the players who are entering like $1,000 heads up, $1,000 GPPs. Look at their lineups in these double ups or single entry GPPs and just see how they're different from yours, what players they're using that are unexpected, and think about why, because I think there's a lot you can just learn from those players. They're good. They're playing these high stakes for reasons. And I think obviously they're going to make some plays that you might not understand initially, but you possibly can learn something from.
Yeah, I could follow up on that too. I think one thing that can be really a red herring is just paying attention to the results of each slate or each week. You know, there's a lot of variance in DFS. So a lot of times, like when someone does good or bad, you're not necessarily going to know whether, you know, that was luck-based or that was something that was predictable. So I think, I mean, one thing that's really helped me and Max both get a lot better is our like learning computer programming and data science is something that's an integral part of our process. So I think really that's a way that I'd really recommend if you're really trying to, if you really want to get good at DFS, that you have to have a data science aspect to your research.
And for that, Danny, do you think like that is a necessity for all players, or is this something where like, I think there's got to be a line you got to draw somewhere where if you want to compete at the absolute highest stakes, you do have to get
totally
treat it like a full-time job and probably look at some advanced analytics. But if you're trying to make some money at the side, playing the under $3 contest, like, do you think how far do you have to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really good research out there and a lot of good people who've done a lot of good research. And I think for someone who maybe, you know, doesn't want to do all the research themselves or doesn't have the ability to you know, do that research themselves, there's a lot of people you can follow on Twitter. There's people who have written articles everywhere that have really interesting thoughts on daily fantasy strategy. There's a lot to learn from just everyone on the internet. And I think you can learn a lot and get better just by learning from other people.
Yeah, I will just piggyback on this as well. As you don't really have to, in order to win a daily fantasy, especially if you're using a sophisticated lineup builder like we offer, like if you're taking advantage of correlation, you're taking advantage of upside, all you really need to focus on is getting better at projecting or getting better at doing ownership projections. And I think if you can focus on making sure that when you make an adjustment to SaberSim's baseline projection or ownership projection, you're adding value in some way, that's going to be a win. And if you have enough wins every slate when you're adjusting projections or ownership projection, that's going to make you a profitable player. And so if you can focus on where am I sure that I can add wins to these adjustments, I think you're going to do a lot better, right? And you're going to be profitable, especially on these low stakes contests or these single entry contests or so on and so forth.
And I think that actually is a good way to kind of transition into the next question. And it's something that did come up in chat. And also someone had asked this over email. It's just come up a lot. And it's kind of the idea of if SaberSim or whoever you're using for projections is putting out solid numbers, when should you make adjustments there and why? Like, what are the things that are going to add value to that? You talked about adding wins and finding ways to really kind of improve upon the projections, but what types of things specifically are you looking for there, Max?
Yeah, so I would say anything that uses very advanced statistics or new statistics, SaberSim mostly works off of historical data. So if there's something new that is something that's like stats.nba, which uses cameras to get all these advanced statistics that we don't use, something that has to do with like expected points added, or like there's someone who's named Ben Baldwin on Twitter who tweets out this completion percentage above expectation stat. That is really helpful. Things that are essentially not just plain historical data, you can use these sources and they can add something. I mean, I think there's a fine line, because I think sometimes people can get into quote unquote advanced statistics and you end up just using something that isn't predictive and not helpful. But especially in NBA, I think this is just coming to mind for me a lot. It's just stats.nba. There's a lot of stats out there. People don't really use it that much, but there's a lot of really detailed, really good stats because they're based off of actual cameras, video taping the games, and actually like getting movement and player positions, so on and so forth. And so if you use something like that and you find something that you think is helpful, something like unassisted field goals, drives to the basket, something, have a theory about it, try to look up and see if this theory may or may not have some weight, and use something like that. And I think that is certainly going to add something to SaberSim's model.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that sort of very nuanced information can be really helpful if you're interpreting it from like something that's like a real deep dive into what's going on with a team from a very advanced statistical level. That can make sense to add. I mean, some of the easier stuff to add is just providing the projections with context that's useful. So for example, like basically every projection system is relying on historical data to project out the future. Now, has a player been playing through an injury? Did they have a game where they left halfway through the game? That's something that a model's not really going to know. So adjusting for that sort of context, sometimes teams will decide to drastically change the role of someone on a team. Like, sometimes a team will be like, we're committed to this guy at running back, and we're really going to try to establish the run. That happened this year with David Montgomery. So I guess, reading through the news and understanding where a team has decided to drastically change direction in some way, that can be really useful, and understanding the context of the historical data can be really useful.
Yeah, I think a great example of the injury example is Adam Thielen last week.
Right.
Obviously, he'd been playing through injury for 4 weeks, but we know historically he's been a really, really productive player, and it ended up working out last week when he was back to his old self. This week he might be injured again, so who knows? But when you can catch those things where there's like a recent injury that's sort of marring someone's performance, you can end up just finding an easy way that someone's under-projected, and most people are under-projecting them, and then they end up just being back to their old self, which is not hard to predict, right?
Yeah.
And Max, you touched on this a little bit, but when we get into advanced statistics, when we get into research, when we get into just kind of going over historical data, where do you think people can kind of fall into a trap and overvalue some of the data out there? Max or Danny, either of you guys can jump in on this one.
I'll handle this one.
Yeah.
I think stuff with matchup can be really overrated. Like, there's just a lot of statistics where you can think that they would be predictive of the future when they're really not. Like recent performances is an example. I remember one time a few years ago, Brett Gardner, the leadoff hitter for the Yankees, went on a streak where he had like 7 straight home runs in like 7 straight games, and he was like the chalkiest player every night, and everyone just thought, oh, this is never going to end. Oh, he's going to always hit a home run. He's just really keyed in. But in reality, like, very extreme things are going to happen because of luck alone. So just because someone's done really well in a certain situation or in a certain context doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to be predictive of anything in the future. I mean, another example is like how a team performs against the spread in different contexts. That's something that a lot of touts use in the sports betting industry. It's just not, just extreme things happen, and those extreme things aren't necessarily going to be predictive of something extreme happening in the future. And another obvious example would be like steals in basketball. If someone has a 10 steal game, are they likely to have like a lot of steals next game? No, of course not, because steals are like the most unpredictable stat in all of basketball. You can't, they're very, very random. So don't pay attention to stats that are really, really noisy, basically.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. I think, especially in football, I see this, is people making game script assumptions based on Vegas lines. I think when you're especially if you're playing cash games, I think that can be valuable. But in tournaments, how the game script actually goes, what I found is random enough to the point that unless the spread is just giant, where it's like a almost certainty that a team is just going to be leading the whole game, i.e. like a team is a 14-point favorite. But even we see that, the Dolphins versus Patriots, I think the Patriots are a 17-point favorite in week 17 and they lost. So like,
you don't need to bring that
up. Anything can happen. And I think people just make these assumptions with like a 5-point spread that this team's going to be leading a whole game. And the game script can really go anywhere. And luckily for us, SaberSim accounts for that. So we don't need to worry about that with the smart diversity, like taking into account just small buckets of simulation, which I talk about in another video. I won't get into it, but that's something that a lot of people, they try to like think, oh, how's this game going to go? How's this game, like they're 5-point favorites. This is just going to be a run heavy game. And it's like, no, that is not what's going to happen. You're going to see it today because there's a lot of teams that are 7-point favorites. And one of those teams is probably going to lose, right? So making over assumptions based on that, I think, is a huge mistake.
And this, I think, ties in pretty well to kind of the last question we have about just kind of building that new process. And it's saying, when there is so much noise out there, when there are so many statistics that aren't truly predictive or aren't predictive without a much larger sample size, how can you objectively judge whether or not your process is actually improving or not?
Yeah, I think, it depends on the sport, right? Because you have to think about how much variance is in a sport. And I can just tell you, baseball is one of the higher variance sports. Football is a pretty high variance sport. Basketball is a low variance sport. So if it's something like basketball, which is, obviously going on, we're in the middle of the season right now. So that's something probably people want to hear about. But with basketball, you can actually look at the box scores and say, okay, I adjusted this person's projection because I thought he was going to do really well. And where obviously there's some variance in statistics there, like, if you adjusted it up, he should have got higher minutes than SaberSim expected, and he should have had higher production in terms of fantasy points per 36 or 36 minutes, or just to shoot the ball or whatever you thought. It should basically happen, right? There's variance in outcomes as the person gets into foul trouble, they shoot poorly, but you have an idea that, okay, this actually worked out. And sometimes that's not the case, but you can actually get a lot from what the actual results are. In baseball, you can't do that at all. Like, the results are so random, and we can use that to our advantage, right? Because we can stack some of the low-owned teams that have high upside, and that's going to benefit us. And I think with a sport like baseball, you have to think, okay, what is you have to actually theorize more. You have to say, okay, why do I think this is going to be the best stack? Think about what are sort of the under the radar stacks, maybe try to think of what pitcher might struggle, look at weather stuff. I mean, we take this all into account, but sort of think about it that way and maybe make some adjustments to our ownership projections if you're using SaberSim and want to go that route. And then also just look at, again, what good players are doing and try to assess things that way. Because if you're doing something right, probably really good tournament players will be doing it with you, right? So I think those are the things you have to keep in mind.
Hey, that's well said. I just wanted to add just a few things. One is, I think you're definitely right with what you're saying about basketball, but I just want to emphasize, if you're judging your process based on the results of like a slate in baseball, that's very, very wrong. It's so random that if you're saying, oh, you know what, this team did well and I had this thought about them, so that must be, or and they had this factor in their favor, that must mean that this factor really matters. Terrible. That's not. Yeah, exactly. It's not true. Whether someone performed well or badly in a baseball game is very dominated by luck. So it's kind of like poker. You kind of have to just have some theories about the game and sort of believe in yourself and your understanding of the game and whether something makes sense at a theoretical level, or you have to do some really high level research.